Hi there. Mary Leckie is joining me from Edinburgh, Scotland, where she has a counseling and psychotherapy practice. Mary is a certified practitioner and instructor in logosynthesis. She was first introduced to the model in Sydney, Australia in 2011. And since then, she has been continually learning, using it for her own personal growth and to support her many clients. Logosynthesis supports us to tap into our human potential so that we are better able to support our own health and well being. So, thank you for joining me, Mary. I'm looking forward to a conversation about supporting human dimension in healthcare using logosynthesis. So, thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. It's good to talk to you as always.
Yeah, so to start, can you describe how you were introduced to logosynthesis and what made you curious to learn about this model?
Yeah, when I was living in Sydney in 2011, I was working with a therapist there who came across logosynthesis. Some people from the logosynthesis team came out to Australia and introduced it. And he read the book and tried it on himself and thought, this is really interesting, and tried to do a few things and then decided to introduce it to his practice. And as I was a client, I was introduced to it then. He found it highly effective, and I did. And then when I was moving to the UK in 2012, he suggested that that might be a good model to follow up on. So I did, and in 2013, when I was studying counselling, I came to Bad Ragaz. I went out to Bad Ragaz to the summer academy, and that began my journey. So
Yes, and the Summer Academy is always an interesting learning experience, isn't it?
yeah, it
And a
was
great group of people.
it was incredible group of people, and there was so much integrity and just sort of real honesty and niceness about the way people were working, and it felt good and it felt right to follow that path.
Good. So when I talk about a human dimension, I'm talking about working from a holistic level. And if we think of health as body, mind, and spirit, I'm referring to being aware and working with all three levels. So, in promoting health, often we focus on the body and mind. We're interested in fixing it. So, can you talk to me about the importance of us as individuals incorporating that spiritual dimension into healthy lifestyle routines?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We tend to ignore the spiritual element of who we are, and I mean we are body, mind, and spirit. And um, I think particularly in the medical field, there's very little awareness of spiritual dimension. I think it's available if you're very ill and you need pastoral care, but if you're just sort of in there and needing some support, there didn't seem to be very much from a spiritual perspective. And I think that is the place where we can sort of control our feelings and emotions and our fears and our sense of what could go wrong, or so just that, as you say, that human dimension both in the people caring for us and in ourselves, I feel is quite significant in the medical field.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times once we start speaking about spiritual, we start thinking about religious when really from a logosynthesis perspective, it's much more energetic. And energy is how we feel. And so if you look at, why people go to the hospital, they don't feel well, right? So there's a lot of the emotions and the symptoms that we experience, even the mental and physical symptoms, we feel the distress, and so that is energetic and spirit is energy. And so when we kind of get away from thinking of it from with all the undertones that we have grown up with using those words, and really think about, okay, what is it that we're feeling in the moment and how can we shift those feelings, there is a room there, I think, for spirit. So, as healthcare providers, what does incorporating a spiritual dimension look like?
I think with the spiritual dimension, we always start with ourselves. We need to begin with who we are and what we're about, and get to know ourselves better, know why we're here, why we do what we do, what we're meant to be doing. And I think particularly with logosynthesis, it helps us to remove the obstacles that are in the way of us being who we're created to be and who we're meant to be. It can be done with or without a religious dimension. If you have a faith, then logosynthesis, I find, works very well in conjunction with that. And if you don't, you can still understand that you're a spiritual being. And I think as a healthcare provider, looking after your own internal well-being will affect everybody that you integrate, that you relate to, as you do your work. So feeling if you're getting rid of the things that are stressing you, if you're getting rid of the things that are making you uptight, you will then project that sort of sense of calm and peace to the people around you, and it will flow down through an organization. And so, for each of us, if we start with ourselves and work on what's bothering me, why am I overreacting? What am I stressed about? Then I think things flow naturally. So by shifting our own energy, we help others to recognize theirs and to shift theirs.
And that's one of the challenges I think that's kind of come out of the pandemic, isn't it? That we hear of compassion fatigue. So a
Yeah.
lot of our healthcare professionals have gone into the profession because they are compassionate. And there's been just such an overwhelming demand on their resources
Yeah.
to, that there is fatigue. And then when they're stressed, then they're not as able to be present with their patients, but also they're not necessarily feeling that they're doing what they're there for either, is it?
Yeah, I mean, logosynthesis has been described as a toothbrush for the soul, and it sort of is really. I mean, if you've had a really bad day and you can come home and look at the triggers, look at the things that affected you that day, look at what's left in your system energetically from the day that you've just had, caring for others that are doing things, and you know that there's a way to process that energy that's blocking your system. That can be a really important way to move on, to leave things behind and to refresh yourself for the next day. But when we carry the load of every day of our work and stresses, it eventually breaks us and brings us down. And I
So
think
can
that's been a lot with the pandemic.
so could you give us an example of what that might look like what might bother you when you're working in that healthcare field? What you might take
Yeah.
away at the end of the day when you're working with people who are
I mean, for
struggling?
example, if I'm working with a client, say, have a busy client day, and maybe I've had a session that didn't go quite so well, and I'm, you know, don't really understand why, and I might feel a bit heavy, and you know, maybe there's a bit of distress around that session for whatever reason, and it can often be the client's distress that I'm carrying. Um, I think just focusing inward and thinking, well, what is bothering me? What is this about? What am I holding here? What's left from today? And then just allowing what comes up to come up, and it may be that I have an image of the client, or I might have a sense of the client's energy in my system, or and those three simple sentences then you know are so powerful in clearing that. But before that must come the awareness of what it is that's bothering me, and having the ability to check in with that.
Right, and it is kind of taking that time to be aware that, yes, I am stressed, right? Like, sometimes that's
Yeah.
our biggest block is like, I'm fine, and when we're fine, we don't necessarily check in with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's that self-awareness, and having a model that helps us to be more self-aware, and without being sort of all about me. It's really just a sense of, what am I stuck on? What's stopping me getting to sleep, or what's making me dread tomorrow? Those kind of things, and having the confidence to know that if you stay with that uncomfortable feeling, it is possible to process it.
Yeah, and when we recognize that that's the way we as humans react, right? Like, that's our survival instinct kinda kicking in, so when things do get
Yeah.
really busy, automatically we, we react to things, and so that's
Yeah.
when we recognize that it is a normal response, um, sometimes we can be a little bit more, willing to go and explore it and get rid of it as
Yeah.
opposed to feeling all that emotion.
And often, as we're aware, it's not so much necessarily about the here and now of what has happened that day, but if we're triggered by something that happened that day, it's about exploring what that might mean. And often it comes from, as we know, from something that might have happened years ago when we didn't have that ability to understand or to link in. So just being able to make those connections can really free us from reacting in ways that we possibly don't want to do.
And one of the things in logosynthesis, and you've kind of touched on it already, but one of the things that the logosynthesis community is very big on is doing our own personal work, and oftentimes that is, through supervision and through having support. So just like clients need the support of a healthcare professionals need support of someone to kind of do their own work, right? So
Yeah.
can you
I
talk a
mean, in
little
an
to
ideal
that?
world, we'd all have that support,
Mhm.
that sense of somebody looking out for us and helping us to, and seeing things in us that we can't see in ourselves. I think that's the big thing about getting a guide with logosynthesis is, they're outside your goldfish bowl looking in, rather than you're in there swimming around all day. And so it's often easier for somebody else to say, what's that about? And help you to process things. I mean, to me, the miracle of logosynthesis is the ability to process something that's energetically stuck in us. I think with counselling and psychotherapy, more traditionally, we open things up, and yes, we do often process things by talking about it, but this logosynthesis is quite clean and quite powerful, and just you say you let it go. There's a real letting go of things. And then the measuring thing is the next time you're in that situation, you think, oh, I didn't overreact. I didn't feel that, or I didn't have that same stress about that experience. So
Yeah, and what I notice a lot of times is people say, "What issue?" Like, "That was never an issue for me." And so sometimes that makes it challenging
yeah,
too,
and then
if
you feel that you did nothing. No, I know, and often even with me, I forget that it was an issue. Like I think that is one of the things about it. Once it's processed, you've forgotten about it, and it's hard to remember that you were so distressed about it. So having that measurement that we use to say what is your level of distress is very powerful, because afterwards, and then going back and asking, and what is the level of stress around that now? And it's like, oh, was I distressed about that?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and some things are, kind of, one and done, like the stresses are you can process it and it's gone, and other things are more complex, like if it's something that's been with us a long time and there's been a lot of experiences around it, it takes longer to process. But
Yeah.
each time, in dealing with people, it's, well, I feel better now and I don't revert back to that low. And so it's layer by layer that, and
Yeah.
it's whether it's physical, mental, or emotional, right? Like that, the distress, it's the distress that we work with.
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that it's not a miraculous cure that fixes everything. It's a journey that we go on, that we slowly start putting off things that bother us, and but it doesn't happen overnight. And often we put something off and more comes up, but we are going in the right direction and we're going in a direction. Um, Rather than the opposite, is where everything just piles up and we become more and more bogged down and less able to work to the or to just be in the world in the way that we want to be. Um,
Yeah,
but
sometimes people say, rather than like it's almost like a shift, because a lot of times we say, get over it and move on.
yeah,
Whereas this is more like processing it and moving forward. So I can finally move forward.
and I mean we do. I think there is the ability to get over something and move on, but not by telling yourself. It's by addressing what it is that's stopping you getting over it and moving on,
Yeah.
rather than the other thing, which is just we'll just get over it and park it and think you can do that. Usually you can't. Um, so you go into it and think what and work through the painful experience, and then that helps you to move forward, as you say.
Yeah. And I think logosynthesis beautifully allows you to get in touch with that painful piece because you can process it. So after the sentences process, you feel better. So that there is a sense of calm. And so I think then people are more willing to allow themselves, and especially if that space is held for them, to go there. And
Yeah, there's a sense of safety about traumatic experiences and things that somebody's in it with you and somebody's helping you to put it off, I guess. Like you do when you go for a physical medical condition, you do put your trust that this person's going to help you and hope for the best. With It's a similar sort of thing. You want your emotional well-being to be healed and to be more healthy as well. Um,
yeah, so if we kind of look at the healthcare system in most countries, the focus is on improving health outcomes by treating the physical and mental illnesses that people come forward with. And if it's broke, then we look at fixing it and measuring it. And yet sometimes that energetic piece is a little bit not as well established because it's more subjective and it's a little messier to deal with. So, it's one thing if you can go in and fix a broken leg and see the results. Sometimes the energy around that feels more intense. So for healthcare providers that are kind of working in that area that aren't used to working on that kind of that emotional level or the feelings level, what are some things that you see that can be done to help make it more comfortable and more everyday?
um, I mean, I find it hard to. I have the utmost respect for anybody who works in the health and medical profession. I think it's a very difficult field to be in. It's very stressful. I don't know if you've heard. There's a book here that some young trainee NHS doctor wrote called "This Is Going to Hurt," and he basically wrote his experiences of being in the National Health Service in the UK, and it's now serialized on television, and it's just extreme. The pressure that they're under. So for me to sort of advise doesn't feel quite right, but I would just go back to the sort of general principle that it is important for all of us to look after ourselves. And so these people who are spending 14, 16-hour days caring for others, it's so important that they realize the impact it's having on them, and that they need support too, and that they need help and a sense of somewhere to process some of the traumatic experiences that they have each day. And I think logosynthesis can offer that to people if they understand how it works, and get a learning of, get an experience of how it puts things off that are difficult for us.
Yeah, and I find that it integrates very nicely with other aspects of health. It's one aspect. So, I fell off my bike and banged up my hip. And so, of course, I had drugs to kind of kill the pain. And I went to physio and massage and that. And I went and got an x ray to make sure I didn't break anything.
Yeah.
But logosynthesis offered another element that helped me calm that, when I hit the nerve that was kind of firing away intensely and be able to calm that. And so, there's aspects that it integrates so well with our other forms of healthcare that we offer. And it is precise and structured. So it brings that emotional, energetic work into a precise, structured, repeatable method that we can measure. We haven't published research on it yet, but it is measurable from what we see in people. So yeah. So you recently had hip surgery in Edinburgh, and hip surgery is major surgery. And in addition to the surgery, it was assisted by the Mako robotic arm. So can you tell us a little bit about this experience?
Yeah, it was the first medical procedure I'd really had. I'd never actually stayed overnight in hospital before, and it was an experience. It was something that I was purposely gave some thought to beforehand. How can I use my logosynthesis, and I also have a deep faith, and bring the two of them together to just trust that this procedure will go well. And so I used I mean, I purposely address the fears I might have about what could happen. What, we ask the question of logosynthesis: what's the worst thing that could happen? And the worst thing that could happen is I could just die. So that was
That's
the
pretty
worst.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe not so bad for me
And
because I wouldn't be aware, but um, and things could go wrong. I could have a difficult time. So I did address those fears using logosynthesis. And also that sense of trust in a greater being. We talk about essence in logosynthesis, and the higher essence, which for me is a faith belief, putting my trust that it will be okay, and just having that sort of sense of awareness of how am I feeling. Am I nervous? Am I okay? And I did go in there very calmly. I also prepared by thinking of the people who would care for me before I went in there. I spent some time um, doing some logosynthesis on the stresses of the people who would who would be there for me, who would, the surgeon and the anesthetist and the people around me, and gave some thought to that it wasn't just all about me. These people are there providing this service. So a way of being, I think, with this whole journey, it makes you much more compassionate and aware of others. And I try to constantly hold that awareness of how are the people around me, this isn't all about me. And I found that helpful, and it did keep me calm. And when I was in there, there were moments. I mean, don't get me wrong. This was not just a lovely holiday in the park. It was very challenging, and there were moments. I think, particularly before when I was having the anesthetic, it was in my spine, and I had to bend over, and the anesthetist was a lady, and she was getting the people. There were two guys sort of keeping me steady because if I moved during so they were sort of holding me in position. And I just said to one of the guys, could I hold your hand? And there was this sense that comfort of a human hand was just really calming for me. Um, and there was just a nice atmosphere there. And then when the injection was in my spine, they were just putting me off to sleep, and I was being laid down on the trolley, and the anaesthetist herself, she just came over and she just squeezed my hand gently. And that's what I would call that human touch, that sense of you're going to be okay. There was just a sense of caring, but I think me reaching out and asking for that sort of level of support made people willing to give it. So it was and I don't think I would have been able to do that without my awareness of my own inner process and what I need. Um,
yeah, because a human touch that is energetic, right? That is that
yeah,
feeling and making connection and
my
getting
body
grounded where
was
you
full
are.
of nerves, but the person who held my hand was calm. His calm human energy was being transmitted into me through the touch of a hand. And I had the same experience the night after the operation. I felt really awful in the middle of the night, and I rang the bell, and the nurse came in and she said, "Oh, I felt like I was fading away. There was that sense of, oh, this is horrible. And she came in and she said, "Oh, your blood pressure's really low." And she turned up the drip, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Would you mind sitting with me for a bit?" And she said, "Yes, absolutely." And so she sat and we chatted about everything. And again, I reached out and held her hand. And that moment of just human comfort, that energy transmitted from this calm, lovely human being beside me, transmitted that human energy into my body, which helped me. And then when she was going, she said, "I'm going to bring you in some tea and toast now." And she sat me up and made me drink and eat, and then I rolled over and fell asleep. so, so
And so you wouldn't have been awake for the surgery, so to actually see the robot perform the surgery or any of that, like, do you have awareness
yeah,
of what happened in
no,
the right?
nothing. I was sedated, but there was a trauma, and I knew in the middle of the night that my body had been traumatized. I knew that um, physically I was experiencing a trauma. That I felt that my body was traumatized, and it had been literally cut open. He'd cut through muscle and every single thing, and I know that in orthopedics they use hammers and drills, and so someone
Yeah.
had banged away at my body and taken out a hip and put a new hip in there. And And so I used logosynthesis on that, sort of before I went in, I thanked my hip for its years of service and, and welcomed the new one. And that might sound really silly to anybody who doesn't know the energy of logosynthesis, but there was a real sense of that there was a physiological experience that my body had, and I was left traumatized. And by knowing how to connect to that and to calm that, I was able to move quite quickly through the process of healing.
Yeah, because there is that pre-surgery anxiety, then there's that trauma of the surgery, and then there's the post-surgery stress, right? So there's elements all along the way where your body is experiencing things that are not normal and that do have an impact on your recovery. Because we all know that, the more stressed we are, the greater the impact it, you know,
Like I remember at
holds.
one point, this isn't the loveliest of stories, but feeling really nauseous and thinking, I'm going to throw up. And I did logosynthesis at the time on this, you know, this this physical feeling to throw up, and it ended up that I did very quickly throw up, which I needed to, obviously, to get whatever. It is quite common after and then again I just lay down and slept, and after that I slept for hours and hours. So just having something that I can think, what is that pain? Something extra that just the paracetamol or whatever else I'm being given. It's a
Yeah,
comfort and a
yeah,
reassurance.
and the whole purpose, like Willem, I remember when I first met him, it was, you work with how do you suffer, and we work to relieve suffering or what bothers you, and you work to relieve what bothers you. If nothing bothers you, then theoretically there's no work to be done. Sometimes I
Yeah,
say, well, if what you're doing bothers someone else, you might want to consider consider using it as well.
yeah,
But it's kind of being aware of how you're distressed and having something that you can use, a guided process that could take, you know, 10 to 20 to 30 minutes to just go through a process. And before you start, there's stress. And after you're done, the stress is relieved. To me, that is powerful. And especially when we start to see that, a lot of times stress occurs in patterns and we can interrupt those patterns. So rather than having to cope with the same image appearing every time that's distressing, we can remove that image and move on. Right? Yeah.
yeah. And in a medical situation, it's very, very stressful, and for everybody. You're the person who's caring for you has walked in and cared for 10 people before you. You're not their only person that day. But I think um, I would just say never underestimate the power of human touch and just the warmth of a hand and the warmth of just reassuring somebody physically that you're going to be okay can be very rewarding and very yeah. And again, we're talking about energy, aren't we? When we touch
Mhm.
a person, it's an energetic thing. And
The same as like a smile or kind
yeah,
words. Yeah.
yeah, and that compassion for. I'm quite lucky. I have my family are in the medical field. One of my sisters runs the Children's Hospital in Dublin, so I'm aware of the stress on them, and but caring for the people who care for you when you're the patient, showing some interest rather than just waiting for the nurse to arrive in that morning and hear all your woes. Maybe she's had a bad night. Maybe she's had a tough
Yeah.
time. Asking how are you, and allowing relationships to be a two-way thing of caring for each other is very rich.
Yeah, that's true. Because a lot of times we don't think of it like people go in as a patient and they expect
Yeah.
to be looked after, but there is an ownership there to be caring when we go in so that we can be looked after.
Yeah, it gets you outside of yourself and your own woes. If you're thinking, it was my mum who actually taught me that. I watched her as she was getting towards the end and how she treated the people who cared for her, and she always showed an interest in them. And I think it's a really lovely way to, I watched her make so many friends and so many people who didn't know her for very long, heartbroken when she finally did pass away. And it's just that warmth, that sense of how are you? How was your evening? How did you, caring for the other it makes you feel better in yourself.
So it's
Um,
interesting. Last night, I was scrolling through Twitter like I do with this war going on, and the Canadian Medical Association was running a room talking about how can we do health differently. And so there was a panel of presenters, and they had a great conversation going about how can we do health differently. And one of the things that came up is, there is such a time crunch and such a need to be efficient. And so there was a couple things. One, the comment was made, when we're efficient, sometimes we can do more harm because we're almost imposing traumas
mm,
in the healthcare. And then the other piece was the kindness, but we don't have time for kindness. And so, and you can see how that happens when you go in and there's so much coming at you. And and to me, that makes it even all the more important to do our own self-care so that we're not triggered by everything that's happening, the bells and the alarms and everyone demanding our resources, that we can um, yeah, be there for people, right?
yeah,
And it's not about doing more, but when we walk into a room calmly, we get a very different response and create a very different atmosphere than when we go in stressed. And I know
yeah,
people say, oh, it's easier said than done, Kathy. And I recognize that because really, logosynthesis is the only thing that has allowed me to be calm, to get rid of those triggers so I could be calm in the moment. Like I've done meditation for years, and I'd get up in the morning before I go to work when the kids were small, and I'd spend time meditating. But as soon as I got into my day and all those things were coming at me, I had those same responses again. So it did help. It did help me to kind of find my grounding, but those triggers still impacted me the same way they always did. And to me, with logosynthesis, I was able to start to say, okay, how am I reacting in this specific situation, and identify
yeah.
the
I think that
specific trigger and
that
shift it.
point of kindness and that point about how can time to be kind, and I think that starts with time to be kind to yourself. Once you learn to be kind to your on caring for your own feelings and your own triggers and your own stress, it flows naturally. You don't then have to try too hard to be kind. Compassion is a natural thing that flows from being in a good place within ourselves, and that starts with kindness to ourselves, I think. Not in a self-centered selfish way, but in a way of trying to put off the things that are stopping us being. I think we are naturally kind, compassionate human beings, but when things are blocking us and stopping us, it's very hard to be. So it's yeah. I mean, when I think of, it's funny, I still remember the anesthetist hand on mine. It was probably one of the most stressful moments of her. You've given someone a spinal anesthetic and how she's going into an operation, has to keep me steady. It wasn't a calm moment. And yet she was able to come across as I was being laid down and just gently squeeze my hand. And I will remember that. And I still do quite, was a significant moment of reassurance for me. And it took probably less than 2 seconds but she was obviously in a good space within herself. And, we had created that sense of sort of calmness in the room, I think. So, so
and
yeah,
and to kind of be aware of that, isn't it? Like it's to be
yeah. So someone
aware.
who's racing around being so super efficient to get everything done needs to probably just think, I need more for me here. I need
Yeah.
time to someone to care for the levels of me that are unable to be cared for. And
But
yeah,
it's a little bit how we measure success too. Is how efficient can we be, right? How quickly can we get things done? How many people can we be? Those are all the things that we measure. How quickly can we put people through? How well can we do our job? It's as opposed to kind of being there and taking that.
yeah. And I mean, that doesn't make thing, if I think about just say being an anesthetist, for example, if that anesthetist memory has stayed with me, but Any other anesthetist could have done their job just as efficiently and effectively and would have been, but I wouldn't have something that was human to take away from that interaction. And I think that's what we're trying to get at. How do we bring the human dimension into healthcare? And it doesn't take a lot once you're caring for yourself. And I think logosynthesis offers people an efficient and effective way of doing that.
Well, that's wonderful, Mary. I certainly appreciate your perspective. I was going to ask if you have any key message that you want to leave with people, or
Um, I would just say that caring for our own emotional health and well-being is critical. And in doing that, we change the energetic structures of the world around us. By changing our own energy and shifting things that are stuck in us, we naturally and um, in an organic way change the energy of the people around us in subtle but significant ways. And so I would just encourage anybody interested in logosynthesis to just give it a try. That you've got nothing to lose.
well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, your perspective, and everything that you offer. So, thanks.
Thank you. Lovely to catch up with you.